There are always visitors to the Holywood site here in southwest Scotland. Most people are visiting family graves or walking their dogs, and there are the occasional tourist. Being on site every day, I try to respect their privacy, but if some choose to wander around the older graves and the church precincts, Idris, who's around somewhere, my four-legged companion, often introduces herself to each and every one of them, which in turn creates introduction, which often becomes story time of hidden Knights Templar history. Some visitors are genuinely interested, some not so much. I suspect some think my story is fanciful rather than fact, so they perhaps humour me. It's not surprising, because if the story of our discovery was real, it would be reasonable to expect it to be in the news, both local and national, headlines, and all over social media. People offer advice suggesting a sensible course of action, asking if my wife and I had approached the National Museum or a local university or the many Knights Templar organisations that exist in the world. Someone once told me there are 1,700 Templar organisations throughout the globe. It's an extraordinary number, and one I've never confirmed, having only contacted around a dozen of the more notable Templar-inspired societies. Visitors cannot believe no one has expressed an interest. Surely there must be a history scholar or a postgraduate interested in the site, or even the local history society. There must be someone. In 2021, if my wife and I stood on the other side of the conversation, we too may have offered the same reasonable advice. But that was in 2021, before we found ourselves banging on the doors of the establishment, only to be ignored. After 5 years of approach and over 200 pleas for help, which is fast approaching 100 more, and finding avoidance, deferment, disinterest and ignorance wherever we went, universities, museums, scholars, politicians, journalists, royalty, history institutions, Templars, and even celebrities, I'm still living in a graveyard, living in a 50-year-old Russian army truck, wondering what was so errant about our discovery for it to be so rudely ignored. 5 years trying to burst the academic and bureaucratic bubble that many academics and bureaucrats seem to exist in, oblivious to the harm they cause in the real world. Finding ourselves members of the wrong orthodoxy to receive pastoral care from the academic priesthood, and an establishment that rejects merit and replaces it with, how can I say it politely without offending, stupidity perhaps? In 2021, despite my wife and I's considerable legend in public service, a legend that educated us in the considerable deficiencies of public governance, we were perhaps less than informed about the academic priesthood, a cult deaf and bigoted to any thought not of their own making, and opposed to any challenge to their intellectual authority. Whereas we were aware of history academics often carried a rather negative reputation amongst history professionals, invariably creating uncontrolled eye-rolling in those archaeologists, genealogists and bell historians we originally approached, my wife and I were quite unprepared for the lengths a history academic would go to protect the source of their understanding and their academic discipline. An academic discipline which has less to do with critical thinking and more about preserving the thoughts of other fellow scholars, built on the works of other scholars, which in turn was drawn from the academic's library, corrupted with Victorian theory rather than relying on unfettered original research and robust challenge. From 2021, we would find the academic truly exists in a separate world, oblivious to the public, an exclusive world where the public are seen as outlanders, inferior beings. An elitist academic society, insensible to the very real tribulations their badly drawn intellectual hypotheses cause. The public are in the main oblivious to academia's perverse behaviour, elitist attitude and bigoted nature. To the many, academia is still the fountainhead of learning, and my wife and I accept some aspects are, but certainly some aspects of it are certainly not. In the last video, there's a link in the description below, we discussed the early reception from the establishment, that is Scotland's heritage, governance and academia, to our discovery and the Templar Bells here at Holywood Church. In the video before that, we hope you saw the merit in our examination, which is laid out in full and in much more detail in our archaeological report, accessed through our website as a free download. We presented evidence that shows the bells were sponsored by a Knight Templar master to hang over a Templar convent. If you have watched that video and are not convinced by our evidence, please let us know why in the comments, so we can raise the substance of your doubt in future videos. Skepticism is to be expected, especially as we live in a world of fakery, and that fakery operates from the top down. It surrounds us and blinds us to the lack of value and truth we receive from those serving society every day. If you were to take the time to challenge and question all you read, all you watch, and all you hear, including our presentation, you may then even question your opinion and understanding in consideration of where it actually originates. You may even come to understand the truth and motives behind the many lies we are fed every day by those we trust, and the scale of the lie. You will perhaps understand, in this case, the case of the Holywood Bells, why the public is denied the truth of history, and why the case of the bells further illustrates the delusion and deception within our society's governance. Moral bankruptcy is the price of a secular path where ideology replaces virtue and stupidity replaces common sense. In this video, we'll look at the response to that evidence by the leading scholars, so you can judge the merit in their argument. A Templar historian had been recommended to us by Malcolm Barber, who is considered the world's greatest living expert on the Knights Templar. A second recommended academic was a curator from National Museum Scotland, who would offer less a critique of the whole study, but the curator's focused consideration of the bells as medieval material artifacts, well within the curator's expertise. In hindsight, considering the amount of academic avoidance of our discovery we have experienced in the last 5 years, we consider ourselves fortunate to have the attention of apparently regarded academics critique our investigation early in 2021. And considering the wholesale avoidance and prejudice we have experienced since 2021, in retrospect, to have had their attention in itself was peculiar. It is a thought we will explore in another chapter, in another video. At the time, we were grateful for their consideration, as we assumed their endorsement would either bring authentication of the discovery, or conversely, learned challenge, so we could reappraise our conclusions. Regardless, we expected an objective and experienced view. But in truth, we had faith in our own skill and hard work, as confirmed by our beta read, so we expected the referred academics to see enough merit in our investigation to warrant their mentorship, advice, and perhaps further support, especially as our reveal was potentially an extraordinary and significant event. We'd already tested the investigation's conclusions with those we trusted to offer a harsh, objective, critical view. This was a beta read made up of professionals within the private sector, people with whom we had no personal connection, so we expected no favour. We approached non-history academics because we wanted the report to be as publicly accessible as possible. That is, a readable and understandable exposition on the bells. It was important the report was not a dense piece of scholarly discourse, abstract and theoretical, even though the original report grew from around 70,000 words to around 120,000 words and illustration in later amended versions. Yes, we presented discussion dealing with philosophical topics from a medieval perspective, but only so scenarios and motivations of the bell sponsor and bell maker could be considered empathetically. Our beta read confirmed we had absolutely debunked the traditional academic view and presented compelling arguments that spoke for itself, that the bells were indeed Templar, as supported in earlier historical narrative contained within the local museum. So long, of course, that our technical argument was correct. With such a glowing reception from our beta read, we expected similar acknowledgement and in turn support from the critiquing medieval history academics. After all, the discovery was a huge deal. We had the comfort we had not trodden on the toes of any prior scholarly focused work, so we were not debunking any living or deceased scholars. We were, however, challenging Victorian antiquarians, but these were not scholars. They were in the main hobbyist historians and archivists, trading on their own theories rather than research. Importantly, we were revealing what had been hidden from the historical record, closing the gap in the understanding of the medieval secular clerical class, a topic not rich with academic focus, and identifying the first Templar family of Scotland, again another topic free from academic focused study. To our disbelief, both academics saw no merit in our research or its conclusion whatsoever. Our conclusion, in their view, was incorrect in every respect, and the traditional view, the Victorian view we had unquestionably debunked, was, in their opinion, the correct understanding. The academics' preamble to their critique was headlined with condescension, recognising the hard work we'd carried out, but still regarding our work as meaningless, recommending we read a few books on bell ringing that were little more than pamphlets, so we might better understand the subject of our study, and glib recognition that our work was neatly presented. Digger and I were, to say the least, more than surprised at the derogatory response to our work. We were, in fact, greatly disturbed. Not because the referred academics countered our view of the bells, but because of their complete ignorance of the most basic understanding of key elements, not of our study, but in areas of comprehension that should be well within their own expertise. But the academics had substituted accepted understanding and well-recorded fact with spurious and totally unsupported opinion. I must admit I had to restrain Digger from sharpening the axe so she could break down the door to the academics' ivory tower so she could confront them face to face. The academics were either patently incompetent or imposters, or had intentionally fashioned deceits purely to counter our discovery. But why? Especially as their deceit was so obvious, they and others could not possibly defend them. Deceit so blatant, one academic had refuted their own published work, referenced in our report, in their attempt to avoid agreement with our findings. The academic critique is given in full in our archaeological report, free to download on our website, including our response to the critique. Or you can watch the video in chapter 4, given in the link below, to compare for yourself what is actually presented on the bells and judge the Victorian interpretation of the bells, the view the academics ardently yet badly defend, for yourself. Both academics interpreted the engraving on the bells as the 1898 transcription, warts and all, omitting to raise any challenge why our interpretation was so errant or try to defend where the 1898 transcription was so obviously incorrect. The curator from National Museum Scotland claimed the armorial presentation on the long-waisted bell was exactly what you should expect on a 16th century bell or metalwork, confirming the Victorian view. The curator's argument, however, had obvious problems. Firstly, how could it possibly be a 16th century armorial appeared on a long or high-waisted bell, universally accepted by bell archaeologists as a pre-13th century design? Secondly, on the right is the armorial of the confirmed 16th century commendator of Holywood Abbey, William Kennedy, whom a Victorian antiquarian proposes sponsors the bell. A commendator was a temporary administrator appointed to oversee monasteries in Scotland during the 16th century religious reformation, diverting revenues to laymen rather than monks. On the left is the armorial on the bell. They are not the same. The curator supporting the Victorian view excuses this anomaly by suggesting compromises should be expected on armorials where space is restricted. However, the canvas for the armorial on the bell is as big as it needs to be. It is considerable, 40 centimeters square. There is no space restriction. Exactness in armorial presentation had been a legal requirement since the 13th century, so the approximation cited by the curator was not an option. So the curator's argument had no competence. Plus, if the curator accepts the bell armorial is not an exact presentation of William Kennedy's armorial, how could he assign it with any confidence to William Kennedy? The curator, arguing the armorial design on the bell was exactly what you would expect on a 16th century piece of metalwork, was flawed. They described the scutcheon, the shield design, as a square French shape, which is certainly a 16th century design. However, the escutcheon on the bell is an Iberian or square Old French shape, which existed from the 12th century onwards. Here is an armorial of another 16th century Scottish commendator, James Stewart of Dryborough Abbey, illustrating the square French style escutcheon or shield referenced by the curator. As you can plainly see, there is no stylistic comparison whatsoever between the armorial carved on stone at Dryborough Abbey and the one cast into the bronze of the Holywood bell. The armorial design on the bell is free of the components of 16th century heraldic display and heraldic achievements. And whereas we cannot preclude the escutcheon on the Holywood bell from appearing on 16th century metalwork, we certainly cannot preclude it from a 12th century bell. And are supported by several archaeologists who viewed the engraving without being given the context of where it was found to avoid the Wikipedia entry being repeated back to us. They all estimated the metalwork as 12th or 13th century. Supporting the Victorian view of the other bell, the curator offered an argument that the other bell's shape was exactly what you should expect from a 16th century bell. But as the shape existed from the 12th century to the current day, that argument too had little substance. Both academics cited the engraved bell as 16th century as per the Victorian view, a dating based on the interpretation of the inscribed name as John Welch, a 16th century abbot of Holywood. But as discussed in a previous video or chapter 4, Welch is certainly not engraved on the bell, and the date 1505 is pure invention. The theory proposed in 1898 has no merit, and any competent objective observer is able to see that. There is simply too much wrong, too much contrivance, too much assumption, and not enough evidence to support the 1898 interpretation. The Templar historian and professor of medieval history dismissed our man William Lariche, the bell's sponsor, from being a Knights Templar because, in their opinion, all members of religious orders carried their order designation on medieval charter and medieval legal document. And since William Lariche is not identified on charter with his order affiliation or the title prefix of brother, indicating he is a monk, he is therefore not a member of any religious order. But I challenge anyone to sift through the thousands of 12th and 13th century medieval charters and identify the religious order designation of those confirmed monks that appear on those documents. Just as Clunic, Cistercian, Augustinian, and Benedictine monks, etc., do not declare their order affiliation on charter as practice, neither do those affiliated to the religious military orders. They are no different. The professor also interpreted William Larisse's title masculus, a Latin expression describing the worthy, classically viewed masculine attributes, as simply meaning male, as if a 12th century lord and knight felt it necessary to express his gender on legal record. The professor's opinion was not sound. Instead, the professor was following the existing academic narrative, which itself was incredibly obtuse. Thus, the professor's argument was again more contrivance in an attempt to discount our research rather than argue its due merit. The professor then dismissed the sponsor, William Larisse, as a head of a Templar presbytery, because in their view, all heads of presbyteries were presbyters and not abbots. But this too was false. Presbyters are administrators of Templar houses. They report to the regional master, just as priors report to abbots in regular monastic houses. Both presbyters and priors are not regarded as the spiritual head of monastic houses. William Larisse's dignity is clearly engraved on the bell. He is Master, Dominus, and Father, Abbas, of the Holywood Convent. He is not an abbot. Thus, the professor's argument had little to commend it. We reviewed the academics' responses and attempted to re-engage with the referred academics, respectfully of course, as we required their support. After all, this was a huge event. They must have known what was at stake. And with the merit presented in our report, they must have known we were not so ill-informed to accept their unconvincing counter-opinion. But both academics disappeared, and no further communication was maintained. We reapproached National Museum Scotland with our counter to its curator's critique, pleading the director of the museum to reappraise its curator's response. We were immediately swatted away, with the director of the museum defending their curator's impeccable credentials and professional behaviour as a public servant, choosing to neither review our additional and original evidence or our discovery or even our petition, placing the director of the museum along with the curator and the Templar historian as entirely subjective and negligent and unworthy guardians of history. Digger and I had no reason to doubt the professor of history or the curator's credentials or competence. But considering the absolute truancy of competence in their critique, we had good reason to question the integrity of the academics' motives. It would be in the months and years that followed, and learning obtained from over 200 approaches to other history academics universally, that educated us in what many in the historical sector already knew, but no one did anything about. The harmful dogma that dictated why the two academics intentionally deceived, all to preserve their kind's intellectual authority over historical understanding, and to denigrate any and all challenge to that perceived intellectual authority. What was clear and unambiguous, we had received not the academics' objective critique, but their transparent prejudice contained within blatant deceit. Deceit so poorly offered, it both confirmed our conclusions and discovery were too robust for them to counter with any convincing counter-argument. All the academics achieved was to explicitly present themselves as deviant with regard to presenting the objective truth about history. It was not our work that was hollow, it was theirs, in terms of integrity, ethics, prudence, and objectivity. And with that consideration, despite their positions in the heritage sector, they had no genuine credibility, rendering them incredibly injudicious and extremely duplicitous. The academics' response to our discovery, unknown to us at the time, was an early demonstration of the intellectual corruption that has universally and comprehensively taken root in academic historical study. A rot now so pervasive in terms of the pursuit of objective knowledge, it renders the academically tuned historian an anathema in terms of erudite historical education. This rot is so widespread, our case, our story, our discovery, formed from evidence and fact, not only illuminates Scotland's missing Knights Templar history, but the extent of the deviance in the heritage sector, filled with similarly academically tuned actors, bringing no real public benefit, only benefit to themselves, but ultimately in a lose-lose situation. This is the price of stupidity. We have made the most significant medieval discovery ever found in Scotland, but it is denied not because it is not authentic, but because the heritage establishment has become so corrupted. Regrettably, we consider our discovery is most probably only the very tip of a very large iceberg floating in a sector that has fossilized any progress in genuine understanding, because it chooses to actively punish any skilled, objective thinkers while rewarding bad conformist players, replacing objective, balanced thought and wisdom with ideologically driven incompetence. And perhaps this is what the real purpose of this discovery is all about. In the next three videos, chapters 7 to 9, we discuss the scandalous involvement of a key player in Scotland's heritage sector, a key antagonist in our story, the Scottish Government's lead heritage agency, Historic Environment Scotland. Or I should better describe it as scandalous avoidance, as the agency invents excuse and presents deceit, all to avoid its involvement with a discovery that should be a great boon to Scotland. All because the discovery is made by members of the public rather than the academic establishment. Despite the agency, government quango, declaring itself the lead public body established to investigate, care for and promote Scotland's historic environment, recent news reports tell a very different story. So it is not surprising we will be pulling at another thread of the agency's failure. There is no doubt this is a unique event. And for those individuals and organisations that both see the merit in our appeal and help achieve authentication for the discovery, and new keepers for the bells and the church, we are directing a significant amount of the bell's value on transference of the bells and the church to new appropriate owners, to those that assist, no matter how large or small the contribution may be. Contact us if you can help. In the meantime, as ever, please like and share this video. Subscribe to our channel. And please buy me a coffee in the link below. A good coffee is a luxury I can no longer afford. See you next time.